Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this The Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. Though today you will probably notice that things are actually getting a little bit better, at least on the public debate side. And it all comes down to possibly Reform's best activist from academia, Matt Goodwin. He's also possibly their only one from academia, but there we go. The white British will become a minority by 2063. The foreign-born and their children will be a majority by 2079, and roughly 1 in 5 people will be Muslim by the year 2100. These are, well, one, they're nothing short of quite alarming statistics. Two, they are statistics that have actually been around for quite some time. I think it's worth mentioning. It's just, in the past, you'd end up with clips like this.
The British population has decreased by 600,000, while the minority population has increased by 1.2 million. So, yes lads, we're winning.
And even go back 24 years ago, when the projections were that the UK whites will be a minority in 2100, rather than, God, 40 years quicker, you end up with The Guardian saying whites will be an ethnic minority in Britain by the end of a century. Analysis of official figures indicate that at current fertility rates and levels of immigration, there will be more non-whites than whites by 2100, so not even white British. This was at a time when we were still in the EU, and majority of our population, our immigration, was still from the EU, obviously mostly white countries. It would be the first time in history that a major indigenous population has voluntarily become a minority. Even in 2000, this was not voluntarily. There has never been a time where the British public actively voted for more immigration. Evidence, Enoch Powell was incredibly popular with his speech in 1968. Anyway, rather than through war, famine, or disease, whites will be a minority in London by 2010, and as we saw from Ash Sarkar, that was a reason to celebrate for some people, not just for Ash Sarkar, but also for a lot of white leftists too. I keep having to remind people, white leftists are probably a bigger issue than any minority group. So these statistics aren't particularly surprising to anyone, especially those of us who have been on the internet, especially right-wing Twitter and YouTube, for the past decade or so. And an issue I've always had with people who go on about this, they're not particularly good at selling the story or marketing themselves. Effectively, they can't help but come across as absolutely massive racists when talking about this, which, to be fair, it is an uphill battle. However, Matt Goodwin has absolutely done the right thing here and trying to just show the facts as they are and not get particularly emotional about it. Anyway, this is all in a Telegraph report. White British people will become a minority in the UK population within the next 40 years, a report has predicted. Analysis of migration, birth, death rates up to the end of the 21st century predicts that white British people will decline from their current position as 73% of the population to 57% by 2050, before slipping into a minority by 2063. The research by Professor Matt Goodwin of Buckingham University suggests that by the end of the century, the white British share of the population could have fallen to around a third, which are rates that are not only, they are actually unprecedented, because when the Normans came over and invaded, this didn't even remotely happen. They just took the place of the elites. What's happening here is kind of the opposite. Our elites are still largely white British. They're just oikophobic and absolutely hate the plebs, and effectively don't see them as people, they just see everyone under them as effectively replaceable numbers on a sheet. And the numbers on a sheet are effectively saying, no, we are people, and we deserve and vote for specific policies that have not been implemented for a good, well, half a century, really. And every attempt to try and signal that, Brexit, BNP even, Margaret Thatcher as well. I know people blame her for mass immigration, but there was actually net emigration when she was in charge, so blaming her for this is ridiculous. You get slight successes with Thatcher, but ultimately, why have Farage and Reform got so big in the polls? It's because of realities like this, which in the past have largely been celebrated. And at this point, everyone's fed up with it, and frankly, the accusations of racism haven't been hitting hard since, well, 2022, really. And ironically, a large reason for that is Farage and the various parties he's been part of, because they make sure to get rid of the overt racists. It projects a big rise in the proportion of the UK population comprising foreign-born and second-generation immigrants from below 20% to 33.5% within the next 25 years. By 2100, it predicts 6 in 10 people in the UK will either not have been born in the UK or will have at least one immigrant parent, which at the very least in the past would have shown integration. However, if you are at the point where the white British population is actually a minority, the integration's going the other way at that point. The Muslim population, which currently stands at 7%, is estimated to increase to more than 10% within the next 25 years, and 1 in 5, or nearly 20%, of all people in the UK by the end of the century. Again, that is going to cause quite a shift in British public life, one that, again, people did not actively vote for, and in fact, people were generally voting against for some time. Who voted for the Boris wave? Absolutely nobody. Boris was voted in to reduce immigration, and he made it larger than ever. It is ridiculous. Professor Goodwin, an honorary professor at Kent University, said the research, based on Office for National Statistics and census data, raised a profound question about the capacity of the UK states to both absorb and manage this scale of demographic change. In his report, he said the findings were certain to spark a considerable degree of anxiety, concern and political opposition among many voters who favoured lowering immigration and slowing the pace of change in order to maintain the symbol, traditions, culture and ways of life of the traditional majority groups. Again, which is what I've been saying throughout this video, is effectively what people have been voting for, and they have been delivered the opposite. Also, just to make the point clear yet again, this is a smart way to actually bring the point forward. Who is the onus on from Professor Matt Goodwin? The British state. What are you doing about this massive demographic change? Nothing? Oh, that's not good. You should probably do something about it. It's not going into specifics of certain races or what have you. It's just saying massive demographic shift, making the white British a minority. No one ever voted for that. Are you going to do anything to make sure integration happens? Didn't think so. However, at the same time, they're bringing the Muslim statistics up to show how rapid the change is, and framing it all within how rapid the change is, and obviously insinuating how that could end up being quite bad, given it's not particularly traditional to have an awful lot of Muslims in Britain. In fact, it's unprecedented. And given once again they come from foreign cultures and countries, they're going to be bringing over an awful lot of that culture, and people won't necessarily stand for it. It has been a recipe for disaster for some time, and it's only getting worse. And unfortunately, there's been too many people in power who simply don't want to touch this. Well, now you've got Reform in power. Well, not necessarily in power, they're not in government. However, they do have MPs being taken very seriously, and their biggest academic activist has just been demographics posting. I mean, this is where things get better. The article then goes into birth rates and details of the methodology and things like that. I'm not particularly interested in that because these projections aren't too different to projections that were being made in 2015, which I actually find quite surprising, because given the Boris wave, you'd think that it would be much worse than it is. But the old white British minority by 2066 is effectively still in place. It's just 3 years earlier, which in and of itself should be, somewhat of a white pill. Things aren't getting that bad, if you will, and, well, frankly, we are still at a point where this is effectively savable. But Goodwin goes into his own analysis in the article. Our research suggests that unless there is a radical change of policy, the share of the UK population that is white British will fall sharply from just over 70% today to below 34% by the year 2100. There will be a minority in the country by 2063, just 38 years from now. Among the under 40s, the tipping point will come much sooner, in 2050. That's my demographic. In other words, a child born today will be living in what is close to becoming a white British minority country by the time they turn 25. We will also witness profound changes in where people were born, a population where most people can trace their roots on these islands back over multiple generations, and will make way for one in which a majority were born overseas, or born to at least one parent who was born overseas. Again, the one parent thing is interesting because typically that does show good integration. However, that will be at a time where actually the white British are a majority. But as I said before, if that's flipped on its head, the integration starts going the other way, which is not a good thing if ideally you want Britain to be British. And I'm talking purely of cultural, societal values here, not of, obviously, race and genetics and all that. I've never actually been that bothered by it. However, obviously the rate of change here is an incredibly good proxy for societal values, attitudes, etc., which I do care about. The ties to our nation and its sense of history, culture, ways of life and collective memory will become much weaker, which is exactly my point, and this is how you phrase this. And it's the way I've been phrasing it for ages, and no one's ever managed to really call me a racist for very long. You can't just go on about genetics and skin colour and all that. You have to frame it in this way, which is what Matt Goodwin is doing and what Matt Goodwin understands better than most people. So I am very glad to see him phrasing it this way, and I would not be shocked if this is how Reform start phrasing it. Well, it's how they already are phrasing it, really, but if they start talking about this more in the near future. Goodwin actually then interestingly specifically does go into the Muslim migration scenario. So under a high Muslim migration scenario, whereby the UK receives higher than average inflows from Muslim states, we estimate that 1 in 4 British people will be Muslim by the year 2100, rising to nearly 1 in 3 of the under 40s in this country. And you'll have noticed all these demographic projections are more pronounced among the under 40s. Among young people by the year 2100, whites will only comprise 28% of the population of England, while the UK-born, who are not the immediate descendants of immigrants, will represent just 28% of the English population, a little over 1 in every 4 young people. This will be projected with net outflows as well, which I think if this isn't sorted, you'll be seeing net outflows more and more. As I say already, pretty much everyone I know has some sort of plan to leave the country. It's not particularly a secret, and if that doesn't represent a failed state, I don't know what does. What's the only thing keeping them here at the moment, really? I guess it's that small glimmer of hope that things can radically change, as Matt Goodwin is pushing for, and that can only be pushed for more if you actually get involved, as I have been. At the end of the century, again, young people, some 68% will be non-white, roughly 1 in 4 will be Muslim, and a large majority will have been born to at least one parent who themselves are not born in the UK, precisely because of the policy of mass immigration under both Labour and Tory parties, and which was then turbocharged by the so-called post-2019 Boris wave. The UK is on a course to experience huge and historically unprecedented changes in the composition of its population, and it ain't good. So Goodwin finishes analysis with this. Lastly, it's worth pointing out that while population projections are complex and should be treated with caution, fine, for the last quarter of a century the story with these projections has been one of projections and forecasts underestimating rather than overestimating the scale and pace of change. So it might be worse than we're thinking, in other words. What we can say today with some certainty is that these islands are about to experience a dramatic population transformation that will not only be unprecedented in history, but will also test the state and the social contract like never before. It is high time our political leaders look beyond the short term and try to think just as seriously about the longer term consequences of their policy, and I absolutely agree. Because ultimately, as well as people wanting to leave the country, one of the big reasons people aren't having kids, aside from obviously the expense, on the right wing is an awful lot like the excuse on the left wing, which is, I don't want to bring a child into the not even the country, the world, because the world is going to be burning alive due to climate change and what have you. Obviously all nonsense. However, the right wing have a bit more of a reason to do it. I can see the country dying and I don't want to bring a child into the country dying. I still think that's a bit of a cope, because in the past people were having kids in times of war, for God's sake, when things looked absolutely existential, but I do think that's more based in reality than the, well, left-wing lot going on about net zero and climate change. And that is obviously a big problem. And all these issues with demographic change are being absolutely pushed forward by Matt Goodwin, as he has been doing for some time. And on the same day this was published, the Telegraph podcast had him on as a guest to talk about some of these issues. So let's take a look at some of the clips.
Can we actually just step back and look at how this country is going to evolve over the next 75 years? This is going to be like nothing we have ever seen before. This is going to radically transform how our country looks and feels.
Yep, once again, he's absolutely right, and he's been talking about this for some time now. I saw a lot of people on Twitter especially complaining that, people were talking about this in the past and, they got jailed effectively for it, or at least ostracised. But as I said before, I have some sympathy to that outlook, but also the people that were going on about it were not putting forward their arguments in a particularly clever way, and were not being particularly persuasive about it all. I think out of all the people I can think of who have talked about this in the past, I have maybe seen 2 of them be pleasant and courteous and try and actually have a productive conversation. Most of the others are effectively groypers, and it puts a lot of people off. This is Matt Goodwin being courteous and respectful about the issue, and wow, it's getting in places. It's a mainstream topic now. The Telegraph are talking about it and actually saying, this might be a bad thing.
Not only in terms of race and ethnicity, but in terms of the the lineage and the roots that people have in this country, and the religious identity of this country.
Yeah, all very much true. And as we have been seeing recently as well, a lot of the native population are actually going back to church. I'm seeing that anecdotally myself. My atheist brother and his, I think she's atheist, might be agnostic wife, have been taking their child to church, largely because my mother wants them to, but even they're supporting that there are surprisingly more people than they'd expect to be there. We're seeing a kind of Christian revival, and I think it's being rather unreported at the moment. But I would argue this is probably in some way a reaction to, well, these demographic changes. Now, is that a good reason to look for God? Not necessarily, but, well, they're looking for God, so I can appreciate that.
Now, that is going to raise a whole host of questions. Can you unify a nation state that is comprised mainly of people that have been born abroad and can't trace their roots back over generations?
Yeah, and it's an issue that also comes across with second-generation immigrants, which I'll get into at the end of the video. Because honestly, a lot of the time, the second-generation immigrants are either they are in love with the country and would do anything for it, or they go the exact opposite and will excuse all the behaviour that they have to effectively make the country worse. There is obviously a lot of people in the middle there, but for some of them they seem to go to one extreme or the other, and it's very, very odd. And it does seem to come down to, do they believe the ridiculous amounts of propaganda they've been fed or not by, well, mainstream sources of Britain is evil, etc., etc. Fortunately, some take the complete opposite route of it all, which is very good. But then we go into another clip that's a bit more of a back and forth.
If a child was born today, and let's say they're white British, by the time they turn 25, they will already be a minority within their country. So this is the pace of change that we're going to see. This isn't just a little bit more migration. The UK at the end of this century will look like nothing it's looked like before. It's going to be very profound. Yeah,
again, it's something that everyone worries about. And as I say before, the demographic time bomb, I think, is infecting people's brains to say, well, is there any point bringing kids into this world? It's going to be very difficult for them, and they're not going to have the stability that I had. It's a difficult choice, it really is.
So, to answer your question, Camilla, I think from my point of view, I would take the white bit out of it a little bit. I think skin colour is not so much of an important question in this. I've got, we've all got friends who are black, who are British Asian. The idea that they are less British somehow is quite insulting, so I wouldn't want to go down that route.
Sure, and I do appreciate and even to an extent agree with that. However, when there are an awful lot of people coming over at this rate, and quite clearly we have plenty of evidence to show an awful lot of people are not integrating, and so while you do have these black British, Asian British, what have you, people like Suella Braverman, Ian Wright, what have you, they are becoming much, much less common the further this demographic change goes on. And it's not a good thing, but it's something that an awful lot of people are going to start off their points with, and it's going to get annoying very quickly. There aren't many people who think that being black means you can't be British. I think polling on the issue shows that something like 80-odd% of people agree you don't have to be white to be British. But obviously these people are so used to the racist word being thrown about that they feel like they need to preemptively slap them down. And to be fair, it's actually working these days.
I think it is, as Matt says, it's all about culture. It's all about identity. And there's no reason to fear anything here if, and it's a massive if, people who come to this country embrace British values, and that's really where I think the debate lies.
Unfortunately, you're about, 5-10 years behind reality there. I think we're beyond the big if. I think the if has largely bolted, and this is why an awful lot of people, when it comes to the whole what do we do about immigration debate, it's effectively, okay, you should definitely stop it unless it's obviously required in terms of health service, which even that you can have a debate on. I've no issue with that. But generally people do want, as the Telegraph journalist said, they do want their minority British friends to be able to stay. And obviously the worry is always, oh, we're just going to have this immigration policy based on race. And if you're the BNP, yes. If you're Homeland, yes. If you're Reform, no. And that's why Reform can talk about this and have their activists talk about this and end up on 30% in the polls and look like they're going to win the next election. They're talking about issues that white nationalists were going on about. They're just framing it in a way that is not insulting to your average leftist, or disgusting, I should say, and that's why they end up navigating the media landscape. That plus the issues have all got undeniable. And so again, everyone should be happy about this, but everyone's still having a go at Reform and Matt Goodwin on the dork right, so there you go. But this is all good moves, from what I can tell. And obviously the mainstream right, the Telegraph say, even the Spectator, they're still a few years behind. But I think they're going to be catching up quite radically. Anyway, your average lefty still has quite a lot of catching up to do, with the standard reply being something that is just never going to fly, which is the white British share of the population defined as people who do not have an immigrant parent is a clownish and is utter muppetry, apparently, from Matt Goodwin. So King Charles doesn't count as white British, Nick Clegg doesn't, Ed Miliband doesn't, Boris Johnson doesn't, and neither do Farage's kids. Yes, well done, you found a fair few high-profile examples of people who would not count as white British, which is just such a pathetic attempt to try and discredit this whole argument. It's funny how they're not trying to call him racist anymore, but say, your logic is flawed because King Charles would not count as white British. Which, yes, I suppose it's massaging the statistics somewhat, but at the end of the day, we're still talking about a country where by the end of the century it will be unrecognisable, even if you do incorporate people like King Charles III, Nigel Farage's children, etc, etc, etc. And Sunda Katwala was not the only person to try and say this. David Aranovich also saying the foreign-born and their descendants cover just about everyone in the country. We're all immigrants, don't you know? As if ethnogenesis doesn't come after we all moved out of Africa or Europe or whichever the consensus has decided this week. As if there's not a difference between Huguenots, Jewish populations, and even some gypsies as well, coming over to the UK and slowly assimilating to different degrees of success over time. It happens. Sometimes it doesn't. The problem we're having at the moment is that it's not happening an awful lot more than it is happening. And it's a phenomenon seen all over Europe. And this was shown quite evidently this week in Simon Reeves' Scandinavia. If you don't know who Simon Reeves is, he is a man who does BBC travel documentaries, effectively going to places and covering issues in places that aren't usually largely covered in the mainstream. He actually does very good work, to be quite honest with you, a bit normally left-leaning, but ultimately does always end up being the journalist in that he will typically ask quite hard devil advocates questions. But he was in Scandinavia meeting up with some Somalian refugees, and there was an interesting conversation between the Somali refugee mother and the daughter who, well, is the result of Swedish policy, I suppose we could say. So here's the clip. In fact, I've just realised that the mother, I assume, is speaking Somali, and it doesn't particularly sound Swedish, but I don't know the difference. So I'm going to do a bit of a radio thing for you and read out what she's saying. Our children who are being raised in Sweden need to be aware of who they are and to stay away from trouble. And they should recognise that they are refugees and guests. And the daughter here is obviously just repeating, no, 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 no.
In Sweden, I've never been to Somalia in my life.
Even if a refugee is born in this country, they are still considered a refugee. But how? It's simply how the world works. It may be hidden, but that is the reality. Make sure you tell him this.
I cannot. No, Mom, I cannot.
I just find it incredibly interesting that the mother understands the world very well, and this outlook doesn't seem to have been passed very well onto the child. And I think a large reason for that is effectively the education system in Sweden. It has, a lot like, well, education all over the world, been incredibly, the Western world I should say, been incredibly left-wing, been very blank slatist, and in a sense, this Somali child, or daughter I should say, she doesn't look like she's a child anymore anyway, effectively has been brought up in an education system saying that she is Swedish, and effectively the mother is saying, no, you are still Somali. And it's a problem that an awful lot of Westerners don't really understand. Ethnicity and genetics and lineage and all that matter way, way more to people outside the Western world than it does within. And it's causing an awful lot of tensions in communities, in between the host country and these communities, that are being either understated or completely misunderstood by people like I mentioned before, like David Aranovich, because effectively if a refugee isn't behaving, it's an issue with the host country. Kind of true in a way, because from my point of view, that's them not being policed enough or them not having enough integrationist policies to get them to integrate. But we've lived in a world effectively saying most of the West is evil and you should hate it. Well, now we've got second-generation immigrants either completely believing that or understanding its propaganda. It's all very interesting. Anyway, they carry on by saying, what you kids have done is cause trouble. But Mum, what have we done? You have caused trouble. But what have we done? You've harmed one another, used drugs, etc.
She's putting the blame on us. Like, you guys should know better, like, that you're not in your own country.
I mean, that's all just correct. You should actually know better. You should know not to get into drug gangs, do violence. And the thing is that in a scene just before, all this stuff was being explained by this same Somali girl, or woman. Daughter, if I'm going to differentiate it from the mother, I suppose. So she is asked what the main problems with the generation she's grown up with have.
Poverty. And our way to becoming a rich person is through crimes.
So yeah, she's just excused the whole damn thing. She's given a house, or a flat even, which is relatively comfortable and will likely be more comfortable than it is in Somalia. And it's instantly just excusing all the crime, the drugs and violence and gang violence. Sweden ended up with a massive issue with hand grenade attacks from Somali gangs. And it's all being excused here, effectively because the state didn't give them enough money, after they gave them more than Somalia ever would have. And that is an attitude we are seeing across the West, basically. It's quite funny because in the same show, Simon went to Denmark to effectively ask the Danish how they managed to effectively not have these similar issues.
You release crime statistics showing the nation of origin of people convicted of violent offences.
Again, I want to make it very clear, it's hard to really pin down Simon Reeves' politics. He will always pretty much play the devil's advocate and effectively ask these pushback probing questions to get a better understanding of what is being talked about. But at the end of the day, he's still a bit on the left-wing side of things, so he'll be pushing a bit harder on this topic.
Why have you been doing that?
That's because a lot of people were feeling this. And if we want to solve ordinary people's problems, then we have to know which problems there are in society.
Yeah, precisely. This is exactly what Matt Goodwin has been pushing for and why he's been publishing the data that he has been researching. Because frankly, it's all a bit of a mess, and a big reason it's a mess is because, again, as Matt Goodwin and Reform have been saying, an awful lot of information is completely hidden from us. And crime statistics, I think, are largely hidden from you. I think perpetrators' ethnicity and what have you doesn't have to be recorded, but obviously the victims does. And then you can only get prison populations to try and work out criminal statistics, which obviously gives you the people sentenced and put to prison. It gives you the demographics of that, but you have no idea about, low-level car crime, who's being fined, etc., etc. Denmark just published all that.
The coalition here says by listening to the concerns of all voters on immigration, they maintain trust. Immigration's been reduced. Integration is required. Asylum's now seen as temporary, rather than a route to permanent settlement.
It's madness, isn't it? Denmark's secret weapon to having a healthy democracy is actually implementing what the people voted for. It's crazy, that. It's almost as if that's, again, why Reform are massively rising in the polls, and why Labour and the Tories are just falling short, because they're not able to actually deliver what they were voted in for. And while we're on the subject of crime and integration, it feels like you get, as initially stated by the Danish guy there, it feels like it's all very two-tier, as it's been going on for some time. It feels like an awful lot of, say, native people get unduly punished, while non-natives, whether they're first or second generation, or even third generation possibly, get off slightly lighter. And a big example of this is the case of a few boys who terrorised an old age pensioner and managed to throw fireworks in his house, which burned his house down with him in it. Here is Nathan, I'm not even going to attempt that last name, and two friends throwing a firework through Robert Price's window in Dagenham, East London. Mr. Price died in the fire that they caused. And long story short, Nathan, I believe, got 6 years and his friends got 3. Something like that. Lucy Connolly just had her appeal, and it has been kept in place that she will spend 3 years in jail for leaving a tweet up for 3 hours saying she's very apathetic if migrant hotels get burned down, which isn't even necessarily advocating for it. It's a very grey area tweet, to say the least. And she got half the sentence of someone who actually did burn down a house with a man inside, which seems absolutely ridiculous when violent people are also going to be released from prison quite soon. And I want to make it very clear at this point, I am not saying that white natives can't do horrific acts like this. We all know the story of John Venables and whoever the other guy was who effectively tortured a 2-year-old. That was back in the 90s. There are stories of, young adults burning other young adults when they were tied to a tree. I remember a story about that as well. What I am saying is that typically these types of things would be national headlines. What's happened here is that an old age pensioner who has been... This wasn't the only incident of him being attacked, by the way. Part of the reason he has cardboard all up on his windows, or wood panelling anyway, is because his windows kept being smashed in by locals in the area. Again, locals who, in Dagenham, the demographics aren't great. To a lot of people, this is a window into the future, and it's a problem that doesn't look like it's being taken seriously. And as I say, the only place I saw it be national news was on the Daily Mail. On the BBC, it's specifically in local news under London. Again, this sort of thing you would expect to be national news. No, it's just local news, London. Man 76, yeah, he died in a house fire caused by teenagers. It's almost like it's normalised to that point, where it's only local news. It feels very, very localised and very almost ordinary, and it's not the type of country that people want, and this is why law and order is such a massive thing in reform as well. And it's a bit like how when it comes to police officers arresting people for tweets, you don't even hear about that typically. The only time you do hear that is if they arrest someone who works at the Times. That's what that big 6 officers go to a house over a disagreement with the school board, or governors of the school, sorry, was all about. That's why it made it into national news, because it affected someone in the media class. And again, this is typical of a country that people have voted directly against. This was the point in voting for Boris Johnson, and we didn't get it. So basically nobody bothered voting next time, and we ended up with Labour, who are just making things worse. And that's why we're seeing the backlash on all this. Again, to make it very clear, obviously it's not only immigrants that cause the country to be worse. We have our own homegrown problem, and in fact it's our own homegrown problem that has in turn put in place an awful lot of policies for 30 years that have been absolutely dreadful. And it's obviously being continued by Labour. Anyway, I think with that I have covered everything I want to today. So with that, I would like to thank you all once again for watching. In terms of shilling, tonight there will be a Subnautica playthrough, carrying on with that, so do come along to that. They're much more community nights than actually what the game's about, to be honest with you. It's much more to have a conversation with people in chat, and everyone seems to enjoy it. So if you've not given it a go, please do come along. As for Tosh Talks will be next Tuesday. It will be a topic that I need to do a poll on tomorrow. Subnautica next Thursday again, and then Laughing at the Guardian next Saturday. If you enjoy what I do subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment. Also, if you can give a little bit more, do become a channel member or leave super chats, super thanks. They are great ways to help the channel. Right, with that is everything I had for you for today. Once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.